If you think education is expensive, try ignorance. West African proverb. Anti oppression affects everyone and includes all people, those who have experienced oppression and those who experience privilege. In particular, having privilege means people who experience advantages in the world based on their identity. The struggle of African Canadians against oppression provides a net benefit to the overall struggle by marginalized populations, as the same principles apply. Advances and structural social changes against anti Black racism benefit all oppressed groups. Intersectionality honors the complexities of diverse and marginalized social locations of members of the African Canadian community. An analysis of intersectionality requires consistent interrogation, as there are important cofactors along with anti Black racism that define the African Canadian experience. Any meaningful understanding of anti Black racism needs to center power and how power is often used and abused within the community, particularly in the areas of gender relations, spousal and community violence, sexual orientation, age, religion, and mental health. White supremacy is a worldview and value system of privilege, oppression, domination, and exploitation perpetrated by white peoples and those who benefit from white skin privilege. Anti Black racism is prejudice, attitudes, beliefs, stereotypes, and discrimination directed at people of African descent and is rooted in their unique history and experience of enslavement, colonization, and imperialism. The history of resistance on the part of African Canadians in Canada to racism dates back to enslavement. Unbeknownst to many Canadians is the fact that slavery existed in Canada from the 16th century until its abolition in 1834. Some examples of how anti Black racism is manifested structurally and systemically include things like school suspensions and academic streaming, underrepresentation and social exclusion from decision making, unsafe neighborhoods and working conditions, food insecurity, unsafe neighborhoods, reduced access to health benefit coverage, consistent exposure to violence, fear for safety, racial slurs and attack, police harassment, brutality, and killings, greater risk of police arrest, detention, criminal record, and institutionalization. Some examples are quite stunning. Black youth in Ontario are admitted to prisons at a rate that is 4 times higher than their white counterparts. A Black person in Toronto is nearly 20 times more likely than a white person to be involved in a fatal shooting by Toronto police. Half of Black employees in Canada report facing discrimination when it comes to promotions. Black youth make up 41% of the youth in the care of the Children's Aid Society of Toronto, 5 times their representation in the overall population. Other examples: employment and housing discrimination resulting in not having enough money, family threats of evictions, and losing housing. Effectively confronting anti Black racism in your agency requires an understanding of the role of anti oppression generally as a commitment, the need for solidarity and allyship, the commitment to using an intersectional approach, and an analysis of power. Those things, grounded in an African centered orientation, can optimize the possibilities for success. by a commitment to identifying, naming, and dismantling anti-Black racism in workspaces, building a comprehensive strategy and plan to reduce and remove anti-Black racism from the agency, building strong and collaborative partnerships with the community, actively promoting safer spaces that are anti-racist and anti-oppressive and that invite difficult but necessary conversations, as well as promote healthy communication and build trust and respect by ensuring that there is concrete planning with action steps and accountabilities and timelines that will train all staff and hold leadership to account for the ABR agenda, identify and remove internal policies and barriers that are ineffective in addressing anti Black racism, build new policies where appropriate, center bias free hiring that diversifies the management structure to include meaningful African Canadian representation, implement a trauma informed, healing centered agenda that frames anti Black racism related trauma, comprehensively integrate anti Black racism considerations into all clinical program service delivery models with measurements and competencies, and integrate into the agency's long term strategic plan and priorities with appropriate sustainable resources. Building solidarity, allyship, support, collaboration across different but connected and similar agendas to fight oppression, build access, fairness, equity, and respect requires several things to happen. That allies always center the impacted, that those who are most directly impacted be the ones who will speak to their experience, that allies listen and learn from those who live and experience the particular oppression, that allies can leverage their privilege and status and access power and voice and resources to advance the agenda in a way that is respectful and inclusive and which acknowledge the legitimacy of those who are oppressed. And finally, allies know when to yield the floor, to step back, give space, and share power. Now, here are some values that could drive and anchor the change process in addressing anti Black racism effectively across your agency. African Canadian communities are central to the agenda of advancing anti oppression and addressing mental health and anti Black racism. Communities bring a range of intersected and diverse identities and perspectives and are sites of resistance, resilience, expertise, experience, wisdom, and resources. Agencies should be committed to centering consultation, partnership, collaboration, and joint work with African Canadian communities through a comprehensive and consistent community engagement strategy and plan. Center culture and Black values. We should be informed by and engage positive pro Black values and worldviews, as well as community tools and resources to ensure that our interventions are relevant, culturally safe, and grounded in the context and lived experiences of African Canadians. Transparency and accountability. Our work will consistently model openness, access, and accountability for program and clinical decisions and practices that affect African Canadian children, youth, and families.
One of the signals of that anti Blackness has been that persons of African descent have been excluded, have been erased from the nation's national history. As I mentioned before, the presence of persons of African descent in Canada has usually been represented as recent, as constituted of Caribbean and African migrants. That erasure from the national history means that for some people, persons of African descent have no claim on the nation, have no claim on the history of the country because they were not there. However, that is not true. From as early as 1606, there are records that there was a person of African descent who was part of the community in Port Royal in the early colonial period. That African presence was not limited to that one person. Importantly, the erasure of Blackness from the historical narrative has taken out the story of Matthew da Costa. The earliest historical record of an enslaved African was of Oliver Lejeune, a native of Madagascar who was purchased in 1628 at 7 years old. Oliver Lejeune was not the only African who was enslaved in Canada. In fact, by 1759, there were about 1,200 legally enslaved Africans in New France. Most of them worked as domestic servants in Montreal. The ideology that made the enslavement of Black people possible would not simply disappear. What we see now has historical roots. What we see now has roots in these advertisements of Black people for sale in Canada. The anti-Black racism was alive and well and would continue on beyond the period of slavery. The enslaved Blacks were not alone in the experience of anti-Black sentiment because even those who were free and of African descent were also subject to oppression and anti-Blackness. In addition to enslaved people of African descent, whose descendants continue to live in Canada, who have been erased from the history, who have not received either an apology or compensation for the foul system of bondage to which they were subjected. Early Black communities also included African Americans who joined the British side and who were called loyalists during the American Revolution. At the end of the American Revolution, the names of about 3,000 Black loyalists were recorded in the Book of Negroes. They were transported to Nova Scotia to receive their freedom and land in exchange for the services they had given to the British during the war. However, 60% of the Black loyalists received no land. The few land grants were extremely small and left them in great poverty. Facing official discrimination, anti-Black racism, and destitution, almost 1,200 Black loyalists left Nova Scotia and migrated to Sierra Leone, West Africa, in 1792. Now, significantly, some of their descendants continue to live in these areas today, which means that they have been in Canada for more than 230 years, much longer than most European communities. However, they continue to face racism, marginalization, and oppression. The Black loyalists were not the only free people of African descent who would face anti-Blackness in Canada and choose to leave for Africa through the 19th, through the 20th centuries, and into the present. Although these historical roots of anti-Black racism are so deep, most Canadians suffer from a national amnesia about the treatment of Blacks in the nation. Rather, Canadians prefer to talk about the Abolition Act in Upper Canada, that is Ontario, and Canada's role in the Underground Railroad. There are some people in Canada who, despite the evidence, continue to claim that there was no slavery in Canada, that slavery was an American institution. In 1793, Chloe Cooley, an enslaved Black woman in Upper Canada, present day Ontario, loudly resisted when her owner tied her up to sell her to someone in New York. So the moral superiority that some Canadians have over the Americans should be checked for what it really means. While the Abolition Act of 1793 did not give freedom to enslaved Blacks in Upper Canada, that is Ontario, because it prevented the further introduction of enslaved persons, it encouraged between 40 and 60,000 enslaved African Americans to escape to the province. Most of them traveled on their own, by their own initiative. Their experiences of anti-Black sentiment, however, where white communities tried to prevent them from buying land, because they had to live in segregated residence, because they had to attend segregated churches, and because they had limited opportunities, many African Americans who had escaped to southwestern Ontario were disheartened. Blacks in Ontario also experienced legally segregated education. According to the Separate Schools Act of 1850, Blacks could and were prevented from attending provincially funded schools. They were required to attend poorly resourced Black separate schools. The last one of those closed in Colchester, Ontario in 1965. These conditions were among the factors that encouraged most African Americans who had escaped their enslavement to return to the United States after the American Civil War. The returnees included Harriet Tubman, who had escaped her enslavement and who had become a conductor on the Underground Railroad in Canada. During the 20th century, anti-Blackness shifted from mere neglect to active dislike of Blacks. Black people were erased from the national history. Racist minstrel shows of white performers in blackface who mocked Blacks were very popular into the 1960s. Blacks experienced racism in employment, in housing, education, and in some of Canada's churches. Blacks who volunteered for World War I were initially rejected because white soldiers didn't want to fight with them. The fear that some Black communities faced was demonstrated in two cases of anti-Black racism. By the mid-20th century, there was a significant Black presence in Vancouver in a place called Hogan's Alley, and another significant Black community in Africville, Nova Scotia. Both communities were destroyed, literally demolished by authorities, supposedly for purposes of urban renewal. Black families were displaced, Black communities were lost. Given the deep and enduring roots of anti-Black racism in Canada, we can begin to understand and explain the links between that history and the current impact of anti-Black racism. According to available data, as of July 2020, the Black unemployment rate in Canada is 8 points higher than the white rate of unemployment. University educated, Canadian born visible minorities earn an average of 87.4 cents for every dollar earned by their white peers. Job-seeking people with so-called Black names receive 12 times fewer callbacks. Half of Black employees in Canada report facing discrimination in promotions. Black Canadians make up less than 1% of senior executives. COVID-19 hit Black and minority communities hardest. in terms of infections, hospitalizations, and deaths. Black women are 4 times less likely than other women in Ontario to have a family doctor. Fewer Black students in Toronto graduate from high school than white students. Black students in Toronto are expelled 4 times more often than their representation in the student body. The Black community in Toronto experiences significant bias in policing and are 20 times more likely to be killed by the police than white people. The impact of anti-Black racism on Black people is real, devastating, and deadly. In health, education, policing, housing, employment, and almost every area of life in Canada, anti-Black racism has not only led to persons of African descent being vilified, castigated, and marginalized. Black people are paying with their health, both physical and mental, with low probabilities for success, and ultimately with their lives. In the meantime, much of Canada continues to deny or ignore the deep-seated and systemic problem of anti-Black racism and to take pride in being geographically, metaphorically, and racially the Great White North. The anti-Black sentiment that lies at the foundation of this country helps to explain the current impact of anti-Black racism. This is why it is important to understand and to connect the historical legacies of slavery and colonialism to modern day anti-Black racism.
Brown complicity and white supremacy. We are all racialized in a particular way within a racial hierarchy, and that racial hierarchy serves to uphold white supremacy. The political, social, cultural, and economic system of white supremacy strategically places white people at the top, Black people at the bottom, and many other racial groups in the middle to uphold this system. Now, as a South Asian person, I'm racialized in the middle, and what many would call a quote-unquote model minority. Now, the model minority is a myth in that it erases vast differences in South Asian or brown experiences and positions us all as perseverant, industrious, successful, and wealthy people who don't challenge racist systems and structures in our compliance with white society and the law. But as scholar Vijay Prashad explains, the model minority myth emerged as a political identity in Canada and the United States in the 1960s and 1970s during the rise of the civil rights movement. And it emerged to construct Asians as the quote-unquote answer to racial and economic challenges and be the model race, the quote-unquote deserving other, thereby justifying ongoing racism towards Black and Latinx people. You see, this was intentional by design. And so what does it mean to be positioned in the middle? Well, it means that we experience anti-Asian racism and we uphold anti-Black racism. We experience anti-Asian racism through a combination of Orientalism and imperialism, colonialism and xenophobia, in which we straddle between being model minorities, the answer to racial injustice, and perpetual foreigners, always different, always outsiders. But as scholar Vinay Harpalani explains, it also means that we aspire to whiteness and maintain our proximity to white people through racial claims. Now, racial claims speak to the choice and agency of racialized subjects to increase racial status that is correlated with increases in material wealth, social capital, symbolic capital, and political protection. But aspiring to whiteness also means actively distancing ourselves from Blackness and upholding racist attitudes towards Black people. In both our aspiration to whiteness and our distancing from Blackness, people racialized in the middle are well positioned to uphold the system of white supremacy. Now, sometimes we're unaware of how our racialization influences our relations and worldviews, and sometimes it's intentional. I refer to these intentional moves as brown complicity. In this lecture, you'll hear some of the ways in which South Asians or brown folks are complicit in anti-Black racism and white supremacy. This includes things like our silences and inaction, upholding harmful practices like shadeism, connections between anti-Black racism and casteism, and failing to understand the historical and contemporary manifestations of anti-Black racism that are really very different from our own experiences of anti-Asian racism. These complicities negatively influence the relationship between Brown and Black folks, and it continues to uphold white supremacy, which will ensure the continuance of both anti-Black racism and anti-Asian racism.
So let's also talk about intersectionality. It's important to understand the way in which anti Black racism is produced at the intersection of multiple oppressions. Black men, Black women, Black children, Black working class people, Black LGBTQ2 people, and trans people experience prejudice and racism at the multiple intersections of their constructed difference from normalized and idealized whiteness. The term intersectionality was coined by Columbia law professor Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, and she used it to mark these overlapping experiences of marginalization and violence that Black people experience. In a 2017 interview in which Crenshaw returned to this concept, she summarized it in this way. Intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. It's not simply that there's a race problem here, a gender problem here, and a class or LGBTQ problem there. Many times, that framework erases what happens to people who are subject to all of these things. When we think about Black children and youth, for example, who are Black and come from working class families, we have to consider the ways in which not only their race, but also their gender, their class, and their age intersect to construct their inalienable difference and write them as perpetually outside the domain of normative Canadian experience. Understanding that childhood is not a predetermined category, but is actually socially constructed, means that we have to recognize that all children do not experience life in the same way, that Black children are socially constructed by their teachers, by their guidance counselors, and the police as different from white and other racialized children, as having less capacity to learn and succeed, as being more likely to be in trouble with the law. If these children are boys, the assumption of criminality is magnified. The intersection of their race and gender magnifies their presumed potential for criminality. And if they are girls, their race and their gender intersect to mark them as adult sexual beings. In both cases, Black boys and girls are denied innocence, are denied the humanity that would allow them to make mistakes and to learn and grow from those mistakes in the way that other children are allowed to do. This incident took place in September 2016 when a young 6-year-old girl, according to media reports, allegedly began acting violently, kicking and punching at school administrators. When 2 police officers arrived on the scene and were not able to calm her, they handcuffed the child, they handcuffed her hands and feet for what they described as, quote, the safety of other students and ultimately the child. In a CBC interview, the mother was at a loss to understand what happened. As she says, my daughter didn't have a knife. My daughter didn't have a gun. They refuse to acknowledge the evidence of their existing prejudices. The differential gendering and treatment of Black students is revealed in the way in which this little 6-year-old child was perceived and treated by both school administrators and the police. The differential gendering and treatment of Black students is a persistent concern expressed by students and parents. As exceptional as the story of police handcuffing a 6-year-old girl might appear, it is not singular. African American Studies professor Ann Arnett Ferguson, in a study of a public elementary school in California, demonstrates that Black children experience childhood differently from white children. The school at which Ferguson conducted her research over a 3.5-year period comprised a student body that was 50% Black, 28% white, and 14% Asian and Hispanic, with a predominantly white and female teaching staff. Her study found that rather than being treated as children who will grow and develop into their full potential, Black children are adultified. Adultification, she defines in this way. She says, by this I mean that their transgressions are made to take on a sinister, intentional, fully conscious tone that is stripped of any element of childish naivete. The discourse of childhood as an unfolding developmental stage in the life cycle is displaced in this mode of framing school trouble. Adultification is visible in the way elementary school pupils are talked about by school adults. In this sense, racial difference gets mediated through culture, and Black people get treated as a group that is undifferentiated by their age or by their status. So that adultification is a central mechanism used to categorize and interpret the intersections of race, gender, and age for Black children. These images of the so-called criminal and the endangered species reproduce the narrative of Black boys as a reflection of Black men's perceived unavoidable failures. While white boys who misbehave are seen as naturally naughty and are forgiven and mentored and learn and can grow from their mistakes, Black boys are seen as willfully bad. Black girls, on the other hand, according to Ferguson, are denied any sense of sexual innocence and are over-sexualized at an early age, constructed as imminent sexual beings, as the future mothers and sexual partners of the boys in their classrooms and in their communities. Like Black boys, there is no social mechanism for understanding Black girls as girls. Childhood Interrupted, the erasure of Black girls' childhood, a study by the Georgetown Law Center on Poverty and Inequality, finds that compared to white girls of the same age, survey participants perceived Black girls aged 5 to 14 as needing less nurturing, as being in need of less protection, and as knowing more about adult topics and sex. The authors of the report insist that further exploration of the implicit bias manifested in adultification should lead legislators, advocates, and policymakers to engage in reform to counteract negative outcomes for Black girls. This perception of childhood difference is not isolated to white teachers. Black teachers, parents, and family members are also socialized to understand Black childhood in this way and can get trapped by these myths if they're not conscious of how they operate and the ways in which they themselves may be reinforcing them. In returning to the case of the 6-year-old Mississauga girl, what kind of lasting impact will the trauma of the memory of being restrained and handcuffed by the police have on a 6-year-old girl? How will she navigate the world knowing that she has been marked and labeled violent and a problem? How does a child recover from the violence that adult authority figures have declared over her life? In this section of the lecture, I'd like us to consider how the discourse of multiculturalism as a tool of management specifically impacts the way Black male youth experience and negotiate their gender, race, age, and class in Toronto. Here I draw on the 3 scenes in my article: the criminalization of Black youth, pathologizing and containing Black male difference, and challenging the myth of the neoliberal Canadian dream. So let's begin with the criminalization of Black youth. The legitimization of practices of multicultural exclusion is invoked most powerfully in Toronto in discussions about crime and violence. Sociologists Henry and Tater argue that research on the racialization of media representations of Black people demonstrates how often and the diversity of ways in which Blacks are depicted as the undesirable and dangerous other, and one of the most pervasive and persuasive rhetorical strategies is the racialization of crime. This racialization of urban crime centers a discourse of the problematic Black male, whose cultural inability to assimilate properly into Canadian society creates a burden and drain on the country's and city's resources. The reluctance to accommodate Black people and Black men and youth in particular into Canadian society arises from the difference and fear Black men seem to embody and invoke. And this fear leads to more and more and more public appeals for their containment, control, and management. In discussing constructions of Black masculinity, Black youth participating in a 2011 to 2014 study were aware of the ways in which their bodies were routinely weaponized and the ways in which the intersections of their race, gender, age, and class combined to mark them as visible threat and danger. One youth, for example, powerfully marked the anomaly of his Black body in a country that is socially constructed as white through his sense of alienation as a university student in a primarily white institution. He says in the report, so I had the situation of moving to school in Brock, St. Catharines with majority white people, right? So certain situations like I'm walking down the street to go to my house, somebody driving by throws a milkshake at me screaming out the N-word. It happens. People are looking at me like, hey, that black guy must sell drugs. And after the class, they ask me if I have weed. And the professors would look at me like, what is this guy doing in this class? For this youth, his race, gender, and working class status combined to mark him as an outsider in a primarily white classroom located outside of his Toronto working class neighborhood. His recollections reveal the hypocrisy of Canadian ideas about diversity and multiculturalism that have little meaning politically or even theoretically, since in most of Canada's communities and institutions, whiteness is still the unchallenged norm. The criminalization and weaponization of the youth's race, age, and gender also legitimize the violent and racist responses of his classmates, professors, and neighbors by marking his exclusion as a fact of his cultural difference, as a fear that he cannot be trusted to behave in culturally appropriate ways. Black youth identify the dissonance between social constructions of themselves and their actual experiences as resulting from a deliberate refusal on the part of Canadian society to seek to know how differences of race, gender, class, and age operate in Toronto's diverse communities. That is, as resulting from a refusal to really put multiculturalism into meaningful practice. In making this argument, one youth identified Canadians' misinformation about Black youth's experience as a kind of cultural laziness. He said, those that are making decisions for the Black community and for low-income neighborhoods are people that have never experienced it, and the voices of Black youth are not being heard. So I think a big misunderstanding is these people, lawmakers, decision makers, are not actually in the community, so they don't know the experience. They're looking on it from the outside view, and they're not getting the voice of these youth because a lot of them want to do better, but they don't necessarily know how to do better. The youth demanded not only accountability from decision makers, but also reciprocity. If Black youth are expected to understand and model white Canadian society, that society needs to understand them as well. The youth in the study also critiqued ideas about their presumed pathology by contesting the assumption that their problems with police and lawmakers result from their own poor choices. One youth challenged this notion of individual responsibility by highlighting the limited options available to young Black men in Toronto. At the end of the day, he said, you try to better yourself through pursuing school or getting a job. But I wouldn't be able to get a job because of the address that I have. I'd go to interviews, literally hand out my resume, but they see my area on the news with some guy getting shot, so they're not going to want to hire me. Living in societies where success is measured in terms of economic power and in which educational institutions are deeply implicated in anti-Black racism, Black male youth in the study admitted that many of them had lost faith in education as a vehicle towards social advancement. Where some youth managed to articulate education as a possible mode of social mobility, they recognized that this choice carried very significant social and emotional losses. And one youth explains this. He asks, why do we have rappers, athletes in the schools talking to kids? Why do we not have Black doctors, Black teachers, Black billionaires in the schools talking to these kids? I think just as important as it is to publicize sports and athletes, you should have doctors or lawyers come and show that there are different opportunities out there, emphasizing and publicizing positive Black people so these kids can have a role model. Understanding the limited choices they had been given, these youth linked their future possibilities to greater opportunities for experiences outside their communities and class group and to more diverse role models. One youth articulated really powerfully the impossibility of completing the trajectory from university to the workforce, which middle class and white Canadian children take for granted without support and motivation. He said, in order to make a change, is to be able to spotlight the positive thing or the positive stuff that young Black people are doing in the community and give them other outlets, give them more opportunities, and allow them to see other Black people that are doing positive things. I'm not going to want to go to university if I don't see other people going to university doing stuff with their degree. So if I'm not seeing it, how am I supposed to act out what I'm not seeing? If there are no positive people for me to look up to, then how do you expect me to do that? That stuff is almost impossible. Here, the youth is really going back to that notion of responsibility that somehow, if Black youth don't make it, it's their fault, something they're doing wrong. As these Black youth dare to look beyond their immediate circumstances to dream other possibilities, they call other Canadians into accountability, to seek to know them and to participate as co-resistors in a process of change that involves learning across our differences. Rather than narrating an easy transition from victimhood to multicultural integration, I argue that youth name their own vulnerabilities and challenge us as Canadians to move from behind the veil of racial and class assumptions and the colorblind discourse of multiculturalism to engage honestly with the experiences that mark their differential location in Canadian society. What if we shifted the discussion away from multiculturalism and capitalist success as the only pathways to Black youth futures and considered instead what it might mean for all of us to live in reciprocity with Canada's First Nations people, Black youth, and other oppressed peoples? In repeating the youth's insistence that their futures will depend on the support they receive from anti-Black racism co-resistors.
Now let's move to another structural example of the weaponization of whiteness in hiring and promotion practices. I encourage you to think about how you came to be in the position you are in. What barriers did you overcome to get here? Did someone help you apply for the job, or did you have internal connections? Let's break this down a little further. Hiring and promotion processes are often explained as neutral practices, but my research on anti-racist leadership indicates that this cannot be farther from the truth. First, given patterns of historical oppression, our social identities, especially our race, mediate whether we even believe that we can successfully apply to a particular job in the first place. For some, parents, family members, and friends have experience in these types of jobs and can offer advice on how to navigate the application process, or the particular language to use that might be favorable to the hiring committee, or the ways in which one should translate particular experiences into skills that would be understood by the hiring committee. But not all applicants have access to this insider information, which automatically renders the hiring and promotion experience flawed and unfair. What then happens if someone applies to a position and speaks to particular experiences or skills that are not even included in the criteria for hiring and promotion, or are not recognized by professional bodies? I have witnessed and heard many examples of white and BIPOC applicants having very similar qualifications, and the white applicant being read as more qualified. How often are resumes overlooked based on the address listed or the name of the applicant being too quote unquote difficult to pronounce based on a standard of whiteness? Then we think about the actual interview. I have witnessed many instances in which a qualified Black applicant is read by the hiring committee as being too aggressive or a show-off. At times, they were deemed to be not the right fit for the culture of the organization, especially when racist associations, either intentional or unintentional, are made between Black applicants and perceived aggression, difficulty, and negativity. Now, these are but a few examples of the ways in which discrimination operates in hiring and promotion processes, and the ways in which whiteness proliferates in seemingly neutral spaces. Now, once hired, we can look to other examples of the ways in which whiteness plays out in the workplace. In part, whiteness is maintained through practices such as developing and maintaining informal networks or in-groups that inevitably impact decision-making, or hidden collaborations, secret favors, nepotism, the overprotection of mistakes and harm caused by white people, and the overpunishment of Black people, the assignment of special projects, and providing specialized access to information. Whiteness operates in who is listened to and believed, and who is considered to be a troublemaker or a difficult person because they are asking questions that challenge taken for granted assumptions and the status quo. In response to internal or external calls for greater transparency and accountability, institutions may respond with silence, denial, mechanisms to stall action and change, closed decision-making practices, finding ways to move people out of particular positions, finding ways to block promotions, or silencing people and dissension. Whiteness results in increased levels of burnout and work leaves for Black, Indigenous, and people of color due to experiences of discrimination and harassment. And finally, whiteness operates in the ways in which diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racist work is done within organizations that is often more about saving face and alleviating guilt and shame than it is about making deep structural changes to disrupt white supremacy. I think about the ways in which racialized people are expected to both work harder to prove themselves as equal, being asked or expected to be on the equity or anti-racist committee, or having to educate their colleagues about anti-Black racism and other forms of racism, and having their work often be unacknowledged, unpaid, and at times used as institutional property without any credit. I also think about the ways in which white folks and BIPOC are rewarded for their compliance, for keeping secrets, for their silence and denial, for their ability to cover up mistakes, for knowing how to appease dissenting voices, for making shallow promises or cosmetic changes that do not change structure, for saving face at all cost, and for making those with greater positional power look good while protecting them from harm. On the other hand, BIPOC employees that are less compliant to practices rooted in whiteness, who ask more questions, who challenge the status quo, and who ask for accountability are not simply seen as disruptive and troublemakers, they are often punished for their behaviors, as described above. To challenge whiteness institutionally, it requires that we raise our critical consciousness, that we see the slippery ways in which whiteness operates against anti-Black racism, and to take action by disrupting these patterns and divesting from the false privileges that we are afforded to those of us who choose to align with whiteness. It also requires that we take proactive steps to make structural, procedural, policy, and practical changes towards anti-racism. And I want to be really clear that the impact on Black, Indigenous, and racialized colleagues and employees that challenge white supremacy and whiteness in their institutions is far more dangerous than the impact on white colleagues and employees. Therefore, it is absolutely necessary that white folks who are afforded greater protection and greater assumptions of innocence take even greater risks to dismantle anti-Black racism and other forms of racism in their institutions.
Today, we're going to outline 3 specific strategies that you can use to build allyship, to practice allyship. The first is leveraging space. The second is leveraging access. And the third is leveraging wisdom. Now, part of why I think these skills are really useful is because as professionals, we all have access to them. We all have space, we all have access, and we all have wisdom. It's just about connecting us with those things. In thinking about what the word space elicits in your thoughts, take a moment to reflect on this quotation by Audre Lorde. There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. Audre Lorde delivered those words in a 1982 address at Harvard University. In this address, Lorde, a self-described Black, lesbian, mother, warrior poet, speaks to the importance of utilizing space as opportunities to heal and learn from historical trauma within Black communities. Given that reflection on space and the meaning that it can have, how can we understand and activate space within our work with young Black people? Well, in allying with young people, we engineer unique and timely spaces to meaningfully connect and build trust. Whether or not we acknowledge it, the persistent impact of intergenerational trauma on mental health of young Black people also enters the spaces we occupy with them. The trauma is coming into the space, whether or not we welcome it, whether or not we have made space for it. Too often, the result of not having made space for the trauma are communicative behaviors that are later labeled as, at times, often by ourselves, as defiant or uncooperative behaviors. Everyone needs space to release. We all need space to release. Young Black people in particular, as they are releasing their own lived experiences, as well as those of elders and ancestors that have imprinted on them, often without their knowledge. In action, intentionally acknowledging and remembering this trauma is essential to our building community spaces with them. This acknowledgement, this remembering, will model for them how to give space to their own healing and process as they continue to grow. How might we understand and activate access and positionality in our work with young Black people? Well, when allying with young Black people, self-reflection is really important, as systemic anti-Black racism results in Black people having less access to safety and autonomy than our non-Black counterparts. One of the ways that white supremacy uniquely impacts Black people is the false narrative that Black people are a physical threat to non-Black people and to white people in particular. This narrative is one that young Black people are particularly at risk of being impacted by because their Blackness intersects with their youth and that assumed immaturity. In action, non-Black adults in particular need to be really mindful of how they've been impacted by the perpetuation of this white supremacist narrative, although us as Black folks are not immune to internalizing some of these same harmful narratives. Just as we grow up internalizing and putting into practice habits and social norms like daily hygiene routines, we grow up internalizing and putting into practice harmful narratives about each other. Young Black people are brilliant in their ability to observe and respond to signs of discomfort that they observe in service providers and white service providers in particular. Due to the coding of Blackness as being threatening, this ability is a potentially life saving protective measure. Historically, Black people have had to sacrifice our safety for non Black people's comfort. So, particularly when these moments occur between young Black people and non Black service providers, the discomfort observed can easily be interpreted as disgust. Depending on how much self reflection that adult has done, that discomfort may very well be intermingled with an unintentional, unaddressed disgust on the adult side. So it is absolutely imperative that we leverage our access to safety to practice sitting in our discomfort. Try sitting with it. It's essential that we, as adult allies, take responsibility for that discomfort and accountability, especially if we project it in spaces with young people. In practice, grounding ourselves in the difference between intent and impact can be a really helpful tool in entering uncomfortable spaces that call us to be responsible and accountable. For non-Black adults in particular, opportunities for accountability exist both with the young Black people who we're in community with and with our Black colleagues. We're going to move on to the third and final skill of this lesson, which is leveraging wisdom. And to do that, we're going to revisit for one more time some of the work and wisdom of Audre Lorde. Much of Audre Lorde's scholarship asks us to reflect on how our identities and spaces we have access to impacts the work that we do. On how these experiences influence the strategies we use, Audre Lorde writes, "It is learning how to take our differences and make them strengths. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." In the quotation from the previous slide, Lorde is communicating wisdom from her own lived experience as someone whose identity left her at risk of experiencing anti-Black racism, sexism, and homophobia. In addition to navigating these and similar intersections, the young Black people we ally with also navigate youth. And that being said, how might we come to understand and activate a similar kind of wisdom in our work with young Black people? Well, the process of being young while trying to be taken seriously by institutions who have the power to facilitate your care is a really serious, often difficult undertaking, one that young Black people navigate all day. Organizational culture often complicates this process, particularly when mental health support is a kind of service young people are seeking. One of the main ways that white supremacy continuously perpetuates harm is through organizational culture. Part of why people of color continue to be harmed by white supremacy in organizations is because of how implicitly and covertly it operates. And yes, this includes many of the organizations that we work with and for. For this same reason, white folks often experience difficulty identifying when they themselves witness or perpetuate this harmful culture. And a part of that wisdom, a huge part of that wisdom in working with young Black folks, is making space for the ways that white supremacy can show up in these spaces. Whether we welcome it or not, whether we like it or not, it shows up. And it's absolutely connected with the traumas that young people navigate and that we all have to navigate and discuss. And so, as adults with various identities at different intersections, naming this harmful culture when we can, or leveraging opportunities for young people to name it themselves, is a key step to dismantling it. It's often the most accessible step to dismantling it, and it's one that will involve us leveraging the wisdom that we have. We actively engage in the long history of dismantling barriers by disrupting stigma. Throughout this lesson, we've discussed how themes like space, access, and wisdom play key parts in the journeys that young Black people have through their own mental health, and also the journeys that we're on with them as adults and allies in their paths. In leveraging space, we acknowledge all of the space and the incredible room there is to be creative and exploratory and try to make timely opportunities to connect and build trust and really make as much space and room as possible for young Black people to fill up and fill out and speak up.